This episode is brought to you by BattleBards, premier tabletop audio for your campaigns. Use the coupon codes GMJ1, 2, or 3 to get free bonus tracks with your first order at battlebards.com. Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, listener. Greeting, fellow GM and or player. Welcome to episode 106 of Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker, and I'm still not in the Obsidian Monolith again. Obsidian Monolith is having an overhaul, getting some repairs, getting some upgrades, just doing diagnostics and all that good stuff. So I am on my mobile setup again, just recording pretty raw here. So this is going to be another sort of unplugged episode like episode 105. I'm still getting the studio set up after the move. I still don't have a computer set up with proper editing capacity. So I apologize if this episode is a little less polished than the regular episode. And if you're a new listener, please don't judge me on this in episode 105. Go back to some of the earlier episodes that are better produced. But I am in the middle of a move right now and already unfortunately had a couple weeks with no episodes, and I don't like that to happen. So I'd rather put out an episode like this, an episode 105, that isn't quite up to my normal standards than just put out nothing. So this is going to be another world building episode. This is going to be world building episode number 11, I think. And if you are newer to the show and you want to catch up on the world building episodes, I am in the show notes for these episodes listing all the previous ones. So if you go to the show notes for this episode, episode 106, I have links to the previous 10 world building episodes in that post so that you can find them really easily, because I know for newer listeners, there's over 100 episodes now, and that's a lot of content to go through. It's a lot of web pages to go through to find what you're looking for. So anything I can do to make that easier, I will definitely do. So again, normally the show has a little different format. I break it up into segments and whatnot, but I can't really do that so much without my full editing capability. So this episode is going to be just a little bit more off the cuff, and might even be a little bit more off the cuff than the last episode was, because last episode I talked about how I'm going to start going through my materials for Primordia in my various notebooks and whatnot and talk about those. And I'm still doing that, but today, I'm going to do something different, which is I want to talk to you about some things I've been thinking about in the last few days about Primordia. Well, I've been thinking about it for quite a while, but especially in the last few days, because I'm trying really hard to show you the process here. And in order to do that, and in order to make that at all helpful to you, I have to peel away as much of the polish, or I have to show you the nitty gritty, and the dirty stuff. A lot of the stuff that I've been presenting to you on these episodes are things that I've given a lot of thought to, things that I've revised a few times, things that I feel fairly confident in. If not that this is the final form it will take, I'm at least confident that it holds up and it makes sense and it's something to go from or something to start with. It's not something that's going to embarrass me or I'm going to be ashamed about or anything. But it's occurred to me that I'm kind of doing a disservice to you doing that, because, it's kind of the difference. If you were going to learn how to write a novel, you can go and read published novels and that can be very helpful. But imagine how much more you could learn if you could get like one of the early drafts of a novel you like, and you could compare that to the finished novel, and you could see the marks that the editor made with the red pen in that draft and the corrections that were made. You would learn a lot more about the process of writing a novel by seeing the early version in all its ugliness with all the mistakes, and seeing how that became the finished book that you read and enjoy. And I think it's the same kind of thing with this world building. And so if all I show you are things that I'm pretty solid on and are conceptually well realized, then you're kind of missing out on some of the early parts of the process. So what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to try to take you through some thought processes I've been having about Primordia, and namely some issues that are in the setting. I'm kind of trying to vary the stereotype a little bit, or the trope. So the trope in D&D, you're kind of in a golden age of humanity. You know, the elves are in decline, the dwarves are in decline, and we're at a time in the history of the world where humans are everywhere, and humans are politically and militarily the most powerful race or species or culture. So you see this in The Lord of the Rings. You see this kind of thing, although it seems the humans are in decline as well in Lord of the Rings, but less so than the elves and the dwarves. The humans are definitely more present in the world. You see this in Forgotten Realms. You know, you have the elves retreating to Evermeet and whatnot. And maybe that's changed recently, because I'm not well versed on Forgotten Realms beyond 3rd edition, beyond like the Time of Troubles, I guess. So maybe it's different now. I don't know. I feel like you kind of saw that in Dragonlance, although Dragonlance is going way back for me. But I do remember the elves and the dwarves kind of, you know, the elves were in their forests and the dwarves were in their mountain holds. And they were kind of, you know, there were a few discrete places that there were elves and dwarves, and that was kind of it, where humans were everywhere. So that's very much kind of what we expect to see. So a lot of what I'm trying to do with Primordia is I'm trying to stay within the tropes as much as I can, so that, you know, when you play in this world, everything's very familiar and you can kind of figure things out easily. But I don't want it to be just a vanilla generic world, because otherwise, why not just play Dragonlance or whatever? So the idea I've had is that time of like the heyday of the human empires and whatnot is actually in the past in Primordia. That was maybe a few centuries ago. I'm thinking a matter of hundreds of years, maybe a couple hundred years, maybe 300 years, something like that. There were human nations all over the place. They were powerful politically, militarily, economically. And the elves and the dwarves and the giants and the other races were kind of in decline. You know, each of them had their day when they were the movers and shakers of the world. But now, you know, they're existing in relatively isolated communities here and there, and just kind of letting the humans do their thing. And sometime in the last few hundred years, something happened, something big. And I'm still working on what that something is. My favorite idea right now is simply dragons. And I have some ideas about this, but basically that the dragons rose up in great numbers. There had been many very ancient dragons that had been sleeping for centuries or even millennia, that all woke up about the same time and started rampaging around the world, destroying cities, things like that. But whatever happened, the result of that is these human nations were all destroyed. Some of these nations were completely and utterly destroyed. Every city, every town, every village wiped out. Now, a handful of the human nations from that time survived somewhat. And the idea is, and let's just take one nation in example, but this happened in a few different nations. So my city of Alondria was originally the capital city of a nation, of a country. And what happened during this time was the dragons, or whatever it ends up being, were wiping out towns, wiping out villages, wiping out cities. And, you know, they're trying to defend them, but they just can't. They just don't have the manpower to defend everything. So towards the end, a decision was made of, you know, we need to save Alondria. We're losing this war. We're losing cities and towns left and right, and we can't protect them. We don't have the power to protect them. And part of what was going on is there were some of these cities that had mythals or something like them. I think actually the more I develop this, the less they'll become, or the less they'll be like mythals in Forgotten Realms, because what I'm calling mythals right now are going to do a lot more, and there's going to be a lot more to them than mythals in Forgotten Realms. But there were a handful of cities that were ancient cities that like Elandria, that the humans were now living in, but were built by elder races millennia ago. And these cities had these mythals protecting them. And they ended up being the only really safe or relatively safe place in the world. So the country that Elandria was originally part of, the rulers decided, we're losing if we don't do something different. If we keep trying to protect everything, we're going to lose everything. So they decided, we're going to make our last stand at Elandria. We've got this mythal to protect us. We can shore that up. We can really focus our defenses there. So that's what they did. And any cities or towns that were still around at that point basically sent as many people as they could to Elandria. And what happened was, so you imagine these nations breaking down, cities being wiped out. Well, when you wipe out a city, you don't necessarily kill everyone, right? People escape, people get away. So I imagine what happened was here and there, like for instance, in the nation that Elandria was part of, here and there, you would have various nobles who escaped their village or their town or their city or whatever with some soldiers. So maybe you had a baron somewhere, he had a keep, he had an army, all this good stuff, and that keep was protecting a small town, and the town is attacked and besieged and destroyed, and maybe this baron manages to get out of that with a handful of his men, maybe his most trusted guard, or maybe even a chunk of his army he manages to escape with. And so these nobles, when they would escape and just, common peasant refugees as well, would head to the capital or to the nearest city that had one of these mythals, because by this point it was known that those were really the only places that had any prayer of survival. So this is kind of the setup. This is the idea that I had. And right away, when I started running my first adventures in Primordia, I realized that this whole idea of, these isolated cities, and I guess I have to explain a little bit more of it. So the end result in the current day in Primordia is you have a handful of cities that are basically city-states now. They're self-contained, and they are connected to one another for trade and whatnot by portals. And people don't really use the roads anymore because the roads aren't patrolled anymore. And basically these cities are really the only pockets of at least human civilization there are. So it's not like the usual D&D world where between city A and city B, there's a road, and along that road, there are towns and villages and whatnot. It's not like that. Between city A and city B, there's a road, but there's nothing but ruins along that road, and that road isn't patrolled, and that road isn't any safer than any other part of the world. And in fact, it might actually be more dangerous because it's more open. So right away, when I started running the game, I realized that this creates a lot of problems because it changes a lot of the assumptions in D&D and a lot of the way that adventures work and whatnot. There's not going to be any of the the cliche, you're on caravan duty, right? Like you're guarding this caravan that's traveling from A to B. Like that doesn't happen in Primordia. There are no caravans. Goods are traded through portals, not along roads, not on ships or anything like that. So all of that stuff goes out of the way. Your wilderness encounters and having PCs travel across the map from A to B, and that is going to be much less common. And so just this original idea of there's just these handful of self-contained cities in my world, and they're connected by magical portals, and people don't travel on roads between them, opens this whole can of worms to be dealt with when coming up with adventures, when trying to reconcile PC backstories. My first adventure I ran in Primordia, I obviously didn't do a good enough job of explaining everything to my players because I had more than one player with a character who was from somewhere else than Elandria. And, in a normal D&D campaign, that's great. But with how I had Primordia set up, it didn't really, that's something we got to deal with because it doesn't really make sense that you're from somewhere else. No one's from somewhere else. So how is it that your character is from somewhere else? And it's a much bigger thing to explain than it would be in, say, the Forgotten Realms, where you could say, oh, I'm from this place on the other side of the world. And it's not really that big of a deal. It's like, okay, sure, whatever. How'd you get here? That's really the only thing you need to worry about. Oh, well, I guarded various caravans that traveled from here to there and everywhere. And it took years, but I got here. It's not that hard to explain. But in Primordia, it's pretty hard to explain, especially for a low level, like a first level character. It's like, how did you get from this city on the other side of the mountains to here when there's, how did you do that? How did a first level character manage that? It kind of boggles the mind, right? So that can be an issue that has to be solved. Another issue I started thinking about is that, and this is kind of what spurred this episode, because this is really what I've been thinking about the last couple of days, is, D&D assumes a feudal society, right? Medieval feudalism with lords and lords with castles and lands and vassals and lieges and all that thing, all that stuff. Like, that's the assumption of D&D. That's kind of how the society is assumed to work. And, I started thinking, I'm like, do I want to do medieval feudalism with Primordia? I don't have to. I could say that they have capitalism or whatever. And I considered that because, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but there's some problems with the feudal model, with the way I have Primordia set up that have to be addressed if we're going to use feudalism. So my first thought was, well, maybe I won't use feudalism. And I started thinking about, well, what if we use like capitalism and democracy and republics and things like that? And I started thinking about it. And I was having some ideas, but I realized that you start doing that and you're greatly changing the feel of the setting. And you're getting farther and farther away from medieval fantasy into something else, which is okay, which is fine if that's what you want to do. But I had to ask myself, is that what I want to do? And the answer was no. It's like, I want to keep this as close to the core D&D experience as I can while still having fun and coming up with cool new ideas. And, the feudalism is so much a part of that experience. And you see that in all types of fantasy, right? You watch Game of Thrones, it's feudalism. And so I want to keep that. I don't want to lose that. So that was a decision that I made. And I started thinking about it, and I'm like, well, usually, my understanding of how feudalism works is it's a system of various ranks of nobles going from higher rank to lower rank, and lower rank nobles serve higher rank nobles, and each noble is responsible for a territory. So you go down to, kind of the lowest rank, the baron. The baron has a barony, which is usually some kind of castle or keep. And there's some kind of community that's built up around that. And the baron is responsible for that area, which includes the peasants in that area, which, is probably going to be a lot of farmers and herders and things like that. But if there's an actual village or town that's built up around the keep, you might have craftspeople and merchants and things like that. And this baron is responsible for all those people. All those people in the barony pay taxes to the baron. The baron then kicks money up the chain to his superior, which could be a king, it could be a count or a duke or something like that, who controls a larger area of multiple barons, right? Well, you probably already see the problem here. What happens in a system like that, where you have all these landed barons, but they're forced to retreat to the capital city with whatever men they can bring, and their lands are gone. Fast forward 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, what's that look like? What happens to these barons? What happens to a baron who doesn't have his castle anymore, doesn't have his land anymore, who all his vassals are dead, and now he's in this city, Elandria, and he's in someone else's playground now. And I keep drawing parallels or using Game of Thrones, for example, but it's just because, it's in our consciousness right now, and it's such an easy example to use. But you think about in Game of Thrones, you've got King's Landing, and there are the nobles that are in King's Landing, and probably most or all of them have lands elsewhere, but they're at court in King's Landing, and they have their influences and their spheres of power within the city. So you have a noble come in from, the north or something, and now I'm going to be in King's Landing. And it's like they have to carve out a place for themselves, right? And all those nobles that are already established in the city are going to resist that, because if you're carving out power for yourself, then I'm probably losing some power, because it has to come from somewhere. So I realized that we would have a situation here in Elandria where we have these nobles coming in from other places in the country that have been destroyed. And maybe Noble A comes in with 20 of his personal guard. Noble B comes in and he's got, 20 of his personal guard. And he's also got 1,000 men that he was able to get out of there alive, 1,000 soldiers. And men I'm using in just a lazy generic fashion. They could easily be women, men and women. So it's like, what happens with these nobles? Obviously the noble that's got 1,000 soldiers and the personal guard is going to have a leg up over the noble that has just the personal guard, or will he? Because it's like, well, he's got more men, he's got more military power, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's got more political power. And, he's got to find a place for all those people to live. He's got to feed them, So that 1,000 men could actually turn out to be a huge liability in Elandria and not a good thing at all. So these are all questions that I have to answer. And the most important question, of course, is what's the result of this? A few hundred years later in Elandria, what does Elandria look like? What does the political climate of the city look like? What has been the resolution of this conflict between these lords from outside the city with the lords that were already in the city? What does what does the government of the city look like? Did that change at all when these nobles from other places came in? These are all questions to answer. Another question that I had to struggle with, and this is something I dealt with in the very beginning, was how do you feed everybody? Part of the idea of my city-states is that they're protected. And you have the city, and then you have the area of farmland around the city, and that's all protected by walls and mithals and magical shields and protections and whatnot. So again, it's like, well, I have to know how many people live in the city, how many acres of farmland would it require to feed that many people? And then what would that look like? If my city is this many square miles and I have this many square miles of farmland around it, and then I've got fortifications around the entire thing. I mean, luckily this is fantasy, so I don't so much have to worry about if that's even possible or feasible to do. Probably not, but luckily it's fantasy and we have magic, so we can hand wave it. But it's still, something to keep in mind. And it's like, okay, well, and I faced this in my first adventure. It's like, okay, if we're going to leave town, first of all, how long does it take to get to the outside of the city, which you need to know how big the city is and kind of its layout and where are you and where do you need to go? And also, how large is that area of farmland across the city, and how long will it take to get across that before we're actually into the wilds? And so I actually did some research and, how many acres of farmland it takes to feed a person, and drew some maps to scale to kind of get a rough idea of what this would look like. Of course, further complicating matters is, Elandria is on the coast and at the mouth of a river. So I can't have farmland completely around the city. At best, I can have farmland around three sides of it, right? Because the other side is ocean. So, I came up with that, and I'm still I wouldn't bet money that everything's correct and accurate. I just did some Google searching and some reading on Wikipedia. I would definitely love to find some more scholarly resources on medieval cities and how much farmland they required and things like that. But I just thought I would share this with you because, when you're building a world, these are the kind of things you go through. And a lot of times it's just kind of going in circles or spirals. Spirals might be better than circles because it's like you're going in circles and you keep going around these circles. But it's like every time you go around, you kind of change something a little bit. And you're like, oh, well, maybe this. And then what does that mean? And then you explore the outcomes and the consequences of that. And then you decide if you like those or not, and you change something else. And it's a never ending process, I'm sure. I'm sure it's never going to be completely perfect and done. And you're like, yes, I've got it. This is it. But it can be a lot of fun. But I guess what I'm hoping that this will show people, especially people who are new to the game or new to dungeon mastering or new to world building, is it's not like you sit down at a table for an hour and you stand up an hour later and you've got the 7 kingdoms of Game of Thrones in all its glory with all its intricacy. You build it block by block. And a lot of times, you get the thing half built and you got to go back to the beginning and change something. And then it has ripple effects and you got to change all the things that impacts. So one thing that I've been considering with Primordia is, once I figure this out, is this going to be a fun place to adventure? Am I maybe shooting myself in the foot with having these isolated cities that are completely self-contained? Because I don't want to do city campaigns. I know there are people that love running or playing games that take place entirely in a city, like something like Waterdeep or something like that. And I think I would enjoy playing in a campaign like that, at least for a time. But I don't know that I would. Let's say this differently. It's not that I wouldn't enjoy running a game like that. I think I could enjoy running a game like that. It's just there are other. I would just much rather do something else. I would much rather run a game where the PCs are traveling the world and exploring forgotten places and things like that. I'm not a huge fan of cities in the real world. They're great places to visit, not great places to live. And I kind of feel like that's how it is with a campaign. A city is a great place to visit in your campaign. They're great places to go for a few sessions or whatever, but I wouldn't want to spend a whole campaign there. That's just me. That's just, personal taste. I'm not saying that campaign or city campaigns are bad and wilderness campaigns are good or anything like that. I'm just saying that my personal taste, I don't want to spend a year of D&D play in a city. Like that just wouldn't be fun for me. If I wanted to do that, if I wanted to run city campaigns, then this would be a great setup for that because it kind of encourages that, right? Like what I've got so far, it really discourages you leaving the city unless you're a pretty capable adventuring party, and you've got all your bases covered. Then you can go explore the wilderness all you want and have a blast. But if you're not in that situation, then you probably don't want to leave the city at all. So right now, what I'm considering doing to address this is that things are changing again. And a great piece of advice I can give you, whether you're designing a world or you're just thinking about your next adventure or your next campaign, is a good story begins in a time of change. If you think about any good story that you love, whether it was a book you read or a movie you saw or whatever, or an RPG you played, most likely that story began with something changing, if not for the world, at least for the main character. So Star Wars, we've got Luke Skywalker goes from being a moisture farmer on this, backwater world to now he's involved with the rebellion and he's saving a princess and he's becoming a Jedi, right? So great, huge change happens to that character in that first movie. And you also see that the setting itself is in a period of change where we have the empire being overthrown by the rebellion. And indeed, the original trilogy of the Star Wars movies is really about that shift in power. And then the prequel trilogy is about the shift of power from the old republic to the empire. So, that's a great place to start, whether you're building a world or you're building an adventure or both, is thinking about, what is changing right now? What's happening in the world that makes this moment the time I want to start my story? This is the interesting time to start my story, right? So obviously what we've talked about with Primordia today, a great time to tell a story would have been the fall of the human nations and when the humans were withdrawing to these cities. But I don't want to tell that story. I want that to be in the past. I want that to be something that happened before, and now we're living in the world that created. So I have to look for another change. So one idea that I had that I think makes sense is that now people are trying to branch out again. So we have Alondria, everything's kind of focused on Alondria. It's the area of the world I'm really working on building right now, like geographically. So Alondria is getting really crowded. There's a lot of people there, and they're getting to the point where they need to do something. At the very least, they need to expand the agricultural areas, which means expanding beyond the outer wall, which means ultimately building a new outer wall along with the magical fortifications, which is a huge, huge undertaking. And one that the authorities in the city are probably trying to avoid. So another possible way to deal with this problem of population pressure, and also this problem with way too many nobles in the city, and just imagining the Machiavellian politics that must be going on in Alondria right now, when you've got way too many nobles fighting over a very small pie, it's probably a mess. So another way out of this problem is, let's try to reestablish some of the keeps, some of the keeps that are closest to Alondria, some of the old baronies. Let's try to reestablish those and kind of fold them under Alondria's protection. And maybe slowly we can build out and get to the point where we have towns and other cities and whatnot again. So I'm thinking that's kind of what's beginning to happen in this time period that I'm choosing to tell my stories in. So getting back to the whole thing with the nobles, something I started thinking about is, if we have all these nobles coming in from the countryside or from other towns and villages and cities, they come into Alondria, maybe they have some retinue with them, maybe they don't, maybe they have soldiers, maybe they don't. They come into Alondria, obviously they need someplace to live, they need something to eat, and they need something to do, right? They need to find a place within the hierarchy of the city, within the business of the city, and find a purpose and a way to fit into the political power structure and all of that. And right away, I started wondering, what is happening between the nobles and the merchants? Because if you know anything about like medieval history and whatnot, part of the end of feudalism, I guess, was the rise of the merchant class, which ultimately became what we now call the middle class. So in the early days of feudalism, you had your nobles and you had your peasants, and that was it. And everything was really clearly defined, because nobles had rankings within themselves where they had a hierarchy where each noble knew where they stood compared to other nobles, and peasants were just equally nothing, I guess. Equally unranked. A peasant was a peasant. It didn't really matter. And, it seemed to work fairly well. But what happened was you had the rise of the merchant class, where you had these merchants who, through trade, were becoming very, very rich. And oftentimes, or maybe always, with great money comes political power. And so these nobles started to these merchants started to rival the nobles as far as wealth and also power and influence. So this is definitely something that would be happening in Alandria. And when you consider a situation where you have maybe a majority of the nobles don't really have much anymore. Their lands are gone. All the things that made them noble, their lands and their vassals are gone. Maybe they've held on to some gold, but I mean, really, how much gold can you cart across country when you're fleeing a war zone, right? Probably not much. So I think that the power of the nobles, even the nobles that were originally in the city and still have their power bases, would be very diluted over time compared to that of the merchants. And I think what we would see in Alandria today is that in general, the merchants actually have more power than the nobles do. And I think we would see a lot of machinations between the nobles and the merchants as these nobles are trying to get power back and trying to increase their power so that they can still be viable and they can still be relevant and compete with these merchants that have all this money. Because keep in mind that the merchants are probably doing really, really well because trade is now as safe as trade could ever be. Because if you're a merchant and you're trading between Alandria and another city, you don't have to worry about taking a caravan cross country and dealing with brigands and monsters and weather and natural hazards and all that. You just walk through a portal, you take a few steps and you're in the next city. So there's very little risk as far as that goes. So I think the merchants are doing really well. Now, something that just occurred to me as I'm talking about this is I wonder, I need to give some thought to what the economics would look like. And I think the economics would much closer parallel modern day economics than it would medieval economics, because we're in a position where goods can be carried from one city to another very, very quickly, kind of like what we have today with airplanes and whatnot. So what does that do? Are you going to see as much of a price difference between cities that trade together when instead of taking months to take goods from one city to another, it just takes a few hours? I mean, I'm not an economist, so if someone knows more about this stuff, I'd love to hear from you. But my guess is that the difference in prices would tend to be smaller. With travel between those two cities so much easier, and transportation almost entirely taken out of the equation. You don't have to worry so much about transporting goods. I would guess that, the difference in prices between city A and city B would be much smaller and there'd be less of a markup. So maybe, I don't know, maybe it's harder for the merchants to make money because there's less profit. I don't know. I'd love to hear from someone that's got a stronger foundation in economics that could maybe shed some light on that or give some thoughts on that. So if that's you and you've got something to share, shoot me an email, gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. So I hope that this is helpful to you, to see how I've created this thing, this idea that I think is a cool idea that I really like, that is part of what I think makes makes Primordia unique, which is I have these self-contained city-states that trade through magical portals, which is kind of one of the seminal ideas of the setting. But how that idea has led to a bunch of problems. And every step of the way, I have to figure out how to solve these problems. And I have to decide, is it worth it? Is it worth it? Or should I just go back to a more traditional, we've got towns and villages and cities and whatnot. And more than once, I've considered doing that. But so far, at least, I've been able to find some answers that I find satisfying, that seem to answer the question. And more importantly, are interesting. Because that's what I'm really looking for all the time, is I'm looking for fodder for interesting stories. So having like the traditional D&D world with towns and cities and villages, I mean, you can definitely tell stories with that, but it's not terribly interesting, if only because, that's the norm now. That's what we're used to seeing. So just this idea of just a few cities and there's not really anything between them, and people instantly travel from one to the other magically instead of taking worlds, that's interesting. That's something different. And it seems like we can take that and build some stories around that couldn't happen anywhere else. But there's still the possibility that someday in the future, I will decide that this is way too much headache and it's more trouble than it's worth. And I may do away with it. But I think if I did do that, what I would actually do is, instead of just throwing everything out and saying, oh, I'm not doing this, is I would just advance the timeline. And I would just put this period when we had these city states in the past, because I'm to the point now that I think it's a cool idea. I think it's interesting. The only question that's still in my mind is, when I'm done, will it be a good setting to play a game in? And that'll be the point where I decide what to do. And if I decide, yeah, this is really cool, but it's not necessarily a great setup to play a game in, and it's like, well, this would be something that could have been in the history that people know about, like when it was like this. But I'm going to advance the timeline now to a point where it's not like that anymore. So we have a setting that's more friendly to gameplay. And I guess that's one last thing I'll mention. I see I'm getting to the end of my allowed time here. So the last thing I think I'll talk about today is the whole thing of timelines in history. And I know that there's a pretty wide spread of how different GMs go about this when world building. You know, some GMs like to sit, and I think it's the game Kingdom, but there's a game out there where the game is developing a timeline for a setting, and that's the game that you play. And I know that there are GMs that like to do that, or just sit down and figure out, you know, tens of thousands of years of history for their setting and all these different epochs and whatnot. And I believe at least once on the show, I've kind of said that that's not my way. And that isn't my way. I think that is a waste of time as far as running a game. You know, anything that you do that you enjoy and that you get something out of it is not a waste of time. You know, some people just love world building. And if you're someone that loves world building and you love thinking about hundreds of thousands of years of history and what's happened in your world, then that's awesome. And that's not a waste of time. But if you're a GM who is building a world and you want to run a game session next week, and you're looking for, you know, getting your world to a point where you can run a game next week, then coming up with 100,000 years of history is going to be a waste of your time, unless somehow that's going to be relevant in the game. And, you know, just as an aside, another problem with going too crazy with your world building and building things that aren't relevant to the game that you're running is it's very tempting to dump all that on your players. And you know, we call that the dreaded info dump, you know, where, oh, hey guys, before we get started tonight, here's 3 printed pages of a timeline of my world that I'd like you to read, of 100,000 years of history. Yeah, your players aren't going to want to read that. And unless it's somehow relevant to what's happening in the game, they shouldn't have to read that. I mean, would their character know 100,000 years of world history? Unless they're a sage? Probably not. And even if they're a sage, they're not going to know all that history, most likely. So that's something to keep in mind too, is, you know, that's kind of this whole philosophy I have of building what you need when you need it. And part of that is just the realities of time management. And, you know, you're best off spending your time doing the things that you need to do to make your next session successful and enjoyable for everyone at the table, as opposed to working on things that aren't going to matter in that next session. You know, so working on a country, on a continent on the other side of your world that the PCs aren't going to visit isn't a great use of your time if your time is limited. You see what I'm saying? If your time's not limited, or you're not running a game right now, then do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Just do what you enjoy. But if you're in a situation where you have to manage your time and you only have a finite amount of time to prepare for your next session, then it behooves you to focus on things that are relevant and important, and try to avoid things that aren't. I hope that makes sense. So anyway, so some GMs like building these long timelines, me not so much. And I made a conscious decision when I started coming up with Alondria that I wasn't going to do that. However, I did want kind of, you need some context, right? And that's the thing I found, and the last point I want to make is, even though I decided that I wasn't going to do a timeline and I wasn't going to worry about, 100,000 years of history or anything like that. I found as I've been fleshing my world out more, I've actually started developing a little bit of a timeline, which is basically, starting at the point where my game starts that I run, going backwards. So I'm not starting at the dawn of time and going forwards. I'm starting at where the story is and going backwards in time from there. Because, there are times when I need to know, what happened that led to this? So we're talking about Alondria. We have these isolated cities connected by portals. Well, what happened that led to that? I kind of need to know that as a GM. Maybe not for the first session, maybe not right away. But at some point, that's something I want to figure out is how did this situation come to be? And what was the situation before that led to this situation? And what was the world like before that? So at the very beginning, I just jotted down real quick. I used the cliche of ages because it's easy, right? And I was like, all right, let's come up with some ages. So I had like the age of Titans, which were the beings that existed before the gods were created. And then there was the age of the gods. And then there was the age of the Fae and the age of dragons and the age of the elves. And my idea was during each age, there was one group that was on top. So during the age of dragons, like the dragons ruled the world. And it's not to say that there aren't other races or creatures around back then, but the dragons were the ones on top. During the age of giants, the giants were on top. During the age of the elves were on top, and so on. Pretty early in my development process for this world, I had the idea that there was actually an age of humanity, but that age is over or it's ending. And there's a new age that is what we're playing in. It's beginning. We're kind of in that transition from the previous age to the next age because it's not like it happens overnight, right? It happens over a span of years or even decades. And what is the new age going to be? Now, in my notes, I'm calling the present age the age of monsters. But in reality, we don't know what the new age is yet. That is going to be determined. And at least partially is going to be influenced by what players do. Because my thought is it's probably going to end up being the age of monsters when we see, there aren't great empires anymore, at least not of, humanoid races. There might be some monster empires like the dragons that arise again. But where we're in the situation where there's not one group that is just overwhelmingly on top, where it's more of a balance of power among all these different groups, which is kind of something new because up to this point, there's always been one kind of powerhouse that's on the scene. And we're to a point now where there's just all these smaller groups that are all fighting tooth and nail for dominance, but there's not a clear winner, at least not yet. But we'll see. Who knows? It could be another age of dragons, could be another age of humanity, could be another age of elves. Who knows? We'll see. So I did have that kind of general idea of ages, but I haven't said, oh, this age was this many years and that age was this many years. And now I have thought about each age having a conflict that was kind of core to that age. And so I think I want to do more with that. And I have a feeling as I do develop the timeline more that the ages as I have them, like the age of giants, age of dragons, will probably go away. And I'll probably have a more interesting system of ages that will be based around a central conflict of that age. So perhaps in one age, we had a war between the giants and the dragons. So that was kind of what defined that age as, maybe it started out at the beginning of the age, the dragons were on top and dominated the world. And by the end of the age, the giants were on top and dominated the world. And that age is the story of the shift in power from the dragons to the giants, that kind of thing. But I think you can see through this discussion how when you're world building and you start thinking about things, how it just kind of spider webs out. And it just ripples out and it just keeps going on in all directions into infinity. I started out thinking about Alondria and the merchants and the nobles and how does that work? And I'm quickly getting to a point where I kind of need other cities now. It's like I'm getting to a point where in order to better understand Alondria's place in the world, I need to know the other cities that they trade with and what they're all about, which is, a whole more cans of worms, right? So, I think one of the biggest jobs in building a world is just deciding what to work on when and what really needs your attention the most. It's like right now, should I start working on developing these other cities so I have some knowledge about Alondria's trading partners? Should I start working on developing my various noble houses and what their spheres of influence are so that I can start to get a better feel for the political landscape of Alondria, or something else? Now, right now, I'm kind of leaning towards, staying focused on Alondria because, thinking about it again from a perspective of I want to run games in this setting and I want to run them now, not a year from now. To me, it makes sense to really focus on one area. And it's like Alondria is a good sized city. You could tell a campaign entirely in the city of Alondria. There are lots of interesting things going on around Alondria, and I do already have some general ideas of a few of its trading partners and what they're like. So, I have enough of that kind of outside stuff, I think, to use if I need to. And I think right now, the best thing I can do is really focus in on Alondria and really develop the city more. And something interesting that's come out of this that has surprised me is I'm starting to think that this setting may end up being a lot more political than I originally thought. And I originally didn't really even think of it. There are people that love political games, and I like playing in a political game. It can be a lot of fun. I don't know that I've ever ran one, or at least ran one very well. Definitely feels outside of my comfort zone or my area of expertise. So, usually when I start thinking of developing a setting or a game or whatever, I'm not thinking, let's do something political. But as we've discussed today, just the consequences of some of the choices I've made in regards to Primordia and Alondria specifically have resulted in this city where I think politics would be very important. They'd be very volatile and very interesting. And even as someone who normally isn't super interested in political things, as I start thinking about, the conflicts among these different nobles, and you have the nobles that were originally part of the city and they had their power base, and then you have nobles that came from other places and have infringed upon those power bases and created their own power bases. And then against all that, you have the merchants, which, have gone from kind of subservient to the nobles to now they're more powerful than the nobles. There's a lot of conflict there, a lot of conflict to play with, a lot that could be done with that. And then you start to throw in things like guilds, like you have things like thieves guilds and whatnot. And you have the Guild of Adventurers, which is a whole other can of worms. How the Guild of Adventurers fits into this and how it fits into Alondria, and where exactly does the Guild of Adventurers fit into the power structure of the city? And, do they report to the queen? Are they on equal with the queen? Can the queen tell them what to do? Could the queen kick them out of the city if she wanted? These are all interesting questions to answer. And the more I dig into this, the more I think, wow, this sounds like a really political place. This sounds like this could easily be on par with what we see in King's Landing on Game of Thrones, as far as all the political backstabbing and whatnot. And I just hope that I can do a setting and a story like that justice, because I think it sounds really cool. But I'm just going to take it one step at a time. So I think that's enough for today. I just wanted to share some of this with you. And again, I apologize if it's not as organized as it could be. But again, I can't do a lot of editing on this. And this is all just kind of on the fly stuff I've been thinking about. It's not something I wrote out or something I've written down. It's just kind of what's been going through my mind and what I've been thinking about. And I'm really hoping to show you kind of how this works for me to help you out if you're going to build your own world or you're a new GM, because even if you're not building your own setting, I think all this stuff is relevant to any GM, because even if you're running in the Forgotten Realms, there are going to be times when you have to come up with stuff yourself. Your players are going to go somewhere on the map that no one's ever talked about before, or you're just going to want to come up with your own city or your own town or whatever. And you're going to find yourself facing probably some of the same questions I've faced. So again, it's a process. It's a never-ending process. And it's just this process of constantly going through these circles and refining ideas, changing ideas, holding ideas up to the light and making sure they're still as good as you originally thought they were, and figuring out how the different pieces fit together, and all the different ways that different pieces could fit together, and then what is the most interesting way. And for me, that's what I try to do, is I always try to keep in the back of my mind, at the end of the day, I'm building this world to play D&D in. So every decision I make, ideally, I'm thinking about, does this make the setting a fun place to play D&D in or not? And so things that make the setting more a fun place to play D&D in are good things and things I want to pursue. So I would love to hear from you what you think about this episode, what you think about the world building, what you think about Primordia. Any feedback that you have for this episode of the show, I'd love to hear from you. If anybody has any ideas on how to address some of these issues, or thoughts on developing a political setting and or a political campaign, I'd love to hear from you. Any thoughts you have, you can reach me by email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter @Lex Starwalker. You can follow me on Google plus Lex Starwalker. Check out the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/gamemastersjourney. And there you can find a link to my Google Plus community for the show. That is a great place to talk about RPGs and whatnot. And also you will find a link to the Primordia subreddit on Reddit, which is a great place to talk about Primordia specifically. So if you have an idea for the setting, or you want to ask me kind of more detailed questions about the setting, the Primordia subreddit is a perfect place to do that. I'd like to give a shout out and a thank you to my Tier 6 patron, Mr. Steve Strickland. Let's hear for Steve.
Yeah.
Hello, Steve.
Yes.
You're the man. So the patrons of Star Walker Studios help keep this show going, help keep me going as a podcaster. And I really appreciate all the patrons and everybody who supports the shows in all the different ways you do so. And you can find a link to my Patreon page at starwalkerstudios.com. Also at the bottom of the show notes, there are a lot of other ways that you can help support the show, like getting a trial from Audible books, using my Amazon referral links, leaving a review, all kinds of stuff, all kinds of ways you can help out if you'd like to give a little back and help keep this project going. The patrons of Star Walker Studios get some cool perks, among them a monthly podcast that I do just for the patrons. And I also, about once a month, upload game materials that I've come up with for the patrons. Some of it Primordia focused, some of it just more general stuff, but try to put something up there every month for the patrons. And yeah, just really appreciate all the patrons. Thank you so much. And as mentioned at the top of the show, I have a new sponsor for Game Master's Journey, Battle Bards, which is where you can get some awesome sound effects and music and monster sounds and all that good stuff for your RPG game. You can check that out at battlebards.com. And if you would like to try out Battle Bards, I have some coupon codes that you can use on your first purchase with Battle Bards. You can use the coupon code GMJ1 to get one free track with a $10 or $25 package. You can use the code GMJ2 for 5 free tracks with a $50 or $100 package, and the coupon code GMJ3 for 10 free tracks with the $150 or $300 package. So I know it's a little complicated. I'm working with BattleBards. We're going to try to figure out a way to simplify that. But you can go to the bottom of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com and find that information there. And I really appreciate your support, and I really appreciate BattleBards helping to sponsor the show. So that's going to wrap it up for me for episode 106. I hope you enjoyed this world building episode. Not sure what I'll be doing with episode 107. Will just depend on how much of the studio I can have set up by next week. But I'll be back with something for episode 107, maybe another world building episode, or maybe I'll return to my topic on clerics and start talking about how I'm hoping to amp up the cleric in Primordia, or maybe something else entirely. We'll just have to wait and see. So I hope you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Stanko, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.